They weren't supposed to find us. But when the gun barrels turned in our direction, I knew we'd taken a wrong turn, one that might cost us our lives. It was a night drenched in silence, a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. But something was off. Beneath the stillness there was a presence, an invisible weight that seemed to press against my chest, making each breath a battle. I turned to Ben, my colleague, and his pale face mirrored my dread. "They've found us," he whispered. Our nightmare began weeks before in the fractured streets of Aleppo. For years, photography had been my refuge, a way to frame chaos and extract meaning from a world unraveling. While others sought safety and routine, I found my calling in the unpredictable, documenting life on the edge. But nothing, not the rubble-strewn paths of Kabul, nor the smoldering remains of Fallujah, could have prepared me for Syria. The year was 2014. The civil war in Syria was at its zenith, tearing the nation apart with a fury that felt almost apocalyptic. Every day brought fresh horror. Cities reduced to ash, families shattered, futures erased. My assignment for the Times was to capture the human cost of the uprising, to illuminate the stories lost in the fog of war. It was a mission driven by purpose but fraught with peril, as every step into that volatile land felt like walking a tightrope over a bottomless abyss. Ben and I entered Syria with the help of Athman, a local fixer with connections deep within the rebel networks. The plan was straightforward: infiltrate Aleppo, document the devastation, and connect with a moderate rebel group willing to share their story. But as any journalist in a war zone knows, plans are fragile things. The journey into Aleppo was an odyssey of dread. We passed through ghost towns, their streets choked with the detritus of war, abandoned cars, charred homes, and stray dogs that skulked like specters. Atman kept his eyes on the road, his silence a grim reminder of the stakes. When we reached the outskirts of Aleppo, the city greeted us like a carcass. Its bones were the crumbling buildings, its flesh the dust that clung to everything like a shroud. The air smelled of soot and despair. We moved cautiously, weaving through the labyrinthine streets, searching for our contact. But fate, cruel and capricious, had other plans. We took a wrong turn, a single fateful mistake that led us into the clutches of men who would shape our lives in ways we couldn't fathom. They appeared suddenly, blocking the road with their battered pickup trucks, their faces obscured by scarves. The glint of their rifles in the dim light was the last thing I saw, before we were dragged from the vehicle and forced to kneel in the dirt. Our captors were not the rebels we sought. They were a faction loyal to a notorious jihadi group, their allegiance marked by black flags and cold, dead eyes. Their leader, Abu Khalid, was a gaunt man with a quiet menace that made my skin crawl. Through Athman's trembling translations, Khalid made it clear we were prisoners, bargaining chips in a game of blood and power. The first days of captivity were a blur of terror. They kept us in a damp basement, our wrists bound with frayed rope. The air was thick with mildew, and the walls seemed to close in, their shadows alive with our fears. At night, the sound of distant gunfire became our lullaby, a cruel reminder of the chaos outside. As the days turned into weeks, a grim routine emerged. They fed us just enough to keep us alive, their eyes always watching, measuring our worth. Khalid spoke of selling us to a more powerful group in Raqqa, a name that sent shivers down my spine. Raqqa was a vortex of cruelty, a place where lives were snuffed out like candles in the wind. Amid the dread, an unexpected dynamic unfolded. Our captors, perhaps bored or curious, began to engage with us. Through Athman, they asked questions about our lives in London, our families, our dreams. It was surreal. Men who held our fate in their hands were now debating football teams and sharing crude jokes. Khaled in particular seemed fascinated by our stories. His icy exterior thawed slightly when the topic turned to Queen's Park Rangers, his favorite football team. I remembered the absurdity of discussing Adel Tarapt's legendary goal with a man who might order my execution. It was as if, for brief moments, the war receded, leaving behind fragments of normalcy. But normalcy is a fragile thing in a war zone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the courtyard, Khaled called me aside. His expression was unreadable, his voice low and deliberate. "You are valuable to us," he said through Atman, "but not in the way you think." Khaled's words haunted me. What did he mean? Was he toying with us, or was there a deeper game at play? My mind churned with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by our captors but by something else, something unseen, lurking just beyond the edges of perception. The nights grew colder, and with them came whispers. At first I thought it was my imagination, the product of frayed nerves and sleepless nights. But Ben heard them too, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked one night, his voice barely audible. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, almost pleading. They were not in Arabic or English, but in a language I couldn't place, a guttural, otherworldly cadence that made my skin crawl. Khaled and his men seemed oblivious, their laughter and chatter continuing as if nothing was amiss. The whispers culminated in a single horrifying night. The air was heavy, electric, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Khaled summoned us to the courtyard, his demeanor colder than ever. "You leave tomorrow," he announced. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Khaled's smile didn't reach his eyes, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "Before you go," he added, "there is a price." I don't remember much of what followed. There was shouting, a scuffle, and then darkness. When I awoke, Ben was gone. Khaled's men were gone. I was alone in the courtyard, the whispers now a deafening roar. The sun rose, casting its light on the horrors hidden in the dark. I stumbled out of the compound, my mind a fog of fear and confusion. Atman found me hours later, his face a mask of relief and guilt. "You're alive," he said, his voice trembling. "We crossed the border into Turkey, leaving the nightmare behind. But the nightmare didn't leave me. The whispers followed me, haunting my dreams and creeping into the edges of my waking thoughts. Ben was never found. His absence is a void I carry with me, a reminder of the price we paid for our ambition. And the whispers, they remain, a chilling reminder that some shadows can't be escaped. The air was thick with excitement as Tony and I set out for what promised to be an unforgettable birthday party. It was April 2016, and we were en route to celebrate a friend's 23rd birthday in Baton Rouge. The venue, a sprawling home in the upscale neighborhood of Santa Maria, known for its luxurious houses and breathtaking landscapes. Anticipation buzzed between us, amplified by the playlist Tony curated from the passenger seat. Yet, amidst the high spirits, a creeping sense of foreboding lingered, a subtle chill that would later make its ominous presence known. Santa Maria's charm, as alluring as it was, came with its quirks. Navigating its labyrinth of similarly named streets became our first challenge. Tony, phone in hand, juggled DJ duties and navigation, but the neighborhood's layout refused to cooperate. Text to friends for directions offered little clarity, drowned out by the deafening music of the party. Manchac Lake Drive, Manchac Way, Manchac Trace. Each street mocked us with its near-identical name, leaving us in a frustrating loop. Finally, after what felt like endless circling, we spotted two houses matching the address we'd been given. Both were eerily dark, with no signs of a lively gathering. Cars were parked outside, but there was no chatter, no music, no glow of activity. We debated which house was the right one. "Let's just knock," Tony suggested, brushing off my unease with a grin. His words, "What's the worst that could happen?" would echo hauntingly in my mind long after that night. We pulled into the driveway of one of the houses. The stillness was palpable. The curtains were drawn tight, but a faint flicker of movement behind them caught our eye. My gut screamed that we were at the wrong place. But before I could voice my doubts, Tony stepped out to knock on the door. Then it happened. A deafening crack shattered the silence, followed by the horrifying sound of bullets piercing the air. The windshield exploded in a spray of glass, and the car filled with the metallic echo of gunfire. My heart froze as flashes of light illuminated the darkness from an upstairs window. "Drive!" Tony yelled, his voice cutting through my paralysis. Instinct surged through me. Slamming the car into reverse, I floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched, the car jolted backward, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. I spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and we sped into the night. The roar of the engine drowned out by my pounding heartbeat. The rush of air through the shattered windshield was cold, biting. My relief at escaping was short-lived. A glance at Tony revealed a nightmare. Blood soaked his shirt, and his face was pale, contorted in pain. A sharp fear gripped me, one far worse than the bullets that had just rained upon us. "Hold on!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "We're almost there!" The drive to the hospital was a blur of desperation and chaos. Weaving through traffic at breakneck speed, I prayed silently that Tony would make it. The thought of losing him was unbearable. My own injuries were secondary. I was covered in something warm and wet, but I couldn't stop to assess. My sole focus was on reaching Baton Rouge General before it was too late. When we screeched into the hospital parking lot, I leapt out and ran to Tony's side, shouting for help. Nurses and paramedics swarmed us, rushing Tony inside as I staggered in behind them. It was only then, amidst the bright, sterile lights of the emergency room, that I realized the wetness on my legs wasn't blood. It was urine. The shame was fleeting, overtaken by the sheer terror of the situation. The waiting room became my purgatory. Time slowed to a crawl as I replayed the events over and over. My phone buzzed constantly with concerned messages from friends, but each moment felt like an eternity. When a doctor finally called my name, the gravity of the moment crushed me. I braced for the worst. "Tony's alive," the doctor said, his tone steady but cautious. Relief flooded through me, leaving me lightheaded. He explained the injuries, a collapsed lung, a broken rib, but no major arteries hit. Surgery had stabilized him, and he was being moved to the ICU. The prognosis was hopeful, but he wasn't out of danger yet. I returned home to clean up and change, a brief reprieve before heading back to the hospital with friends. The drive back was somber, the reality of what had happened sinking in deeper. Walking into Tony's ICU room was both a relief and a shock. He was alive, but the side of him, pale, hooked up to machines, was a stark reminder of how close we'd come to losing him. Despite his condition, Tony managed a weak smile. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice raspy but filled with gratitude. "No," I said, shaking my head, "you saved mine." As I spoke, a chilling realization hit me. Tony's phone, held at chest height, had likely made him the shooter's target. Its bright screen illuminated him like a beacon in the dark. If he hadn't been there, the shots would have been aimed at me instead. The following weeks were a whirlwind of recovery and reflection. Therapy sessions helped me process the trauma, and it was during one of these that I met a Marine who changed my perspective. He laughed, not mockingly, but with understanding, when I confessed my shame over wetting myself. "You did everything right," he said. "Under fire, you kept your cool and saved your friend. That's courage." Those words stayed with me, a balm for my battered psyche. What haunted me most wasn't the gunfire or the shattered glass, but the fragility of life and the randomness of fate. Tony's survival was a miracle, one that I would carry with me forever. To this day, the memory of that night lingers. The quiet terror of the wrong driveway, the explosive violence that followed, and the fragile thread that held Tony's life together. It all serves as a reminder of how quickly things can change. Life is precious, and sometimes courage is simply the act of moving forward when every instinct tells you to freeze. The crisp mountain air greeted us as we embarked on a weekend getaway, a much-anticipated anniversary trip to a luxury cabin nestled in the Appalachian Hills. Rob and I had been together for over 2 years, and this trip symbolized a celebration of our journey together. From our humble beginnings at a local coffee shop, where I had embarrassingly spilled iced latte all over him, to this moment of tranquility, it felt like a dream come true. Little did I know, the serenity would soon spiral into an unimaginable nightmare. When Rob first proposed the idea of a cabin retreat, I was hesitant. My vision of a remote cabin conjured up images of rickety shacks with no running water and makeshift fire pits for cooking. However, Rob reassured me, showing me pictures of a breathtaking cabin perched on a hillside. Its rustic charm blended perfectly with modern luxury vaulted ceilings, a stone fireplace, and even a hot tub under the stars. "Think of it as our private little paradise," Rob said, his boyish grin infectious. His excitement melted my reservations. After spending a few days with his wonderfully welcoming parents in Nashville, we packed up our rental car and headed into the forested hills of Monroe County. As we approached the winding roads leading to the cabin, the GPS began to fail us. The signal flickered in and out, and the printed directions we carried led us down countless dead ends. Each wrong turn heightened our frustration. We retraced our steps repeatedly, the dense forest around us growing more ominous with every misstep. Finally, we spotted a house at the end of a long gravel road. Relief washed over us. Surely someone there could help us find our way. The house, however, was far from welcoming. The paint had faded to a dull gray, peeling in large patches to reveal rotting wood beneath. The roof sagged in places, moss and decay clinging to its surface. Still, we were desperate. "Let's ask for directions," Rob suggested, always the optimist. The creaking porch groaned under Rob's boots as he knocked on the door. For a moment there was silence. Then faint shuffling echoed from inside. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a thick southern accent. Rob explained our predicament, and she told us her husband knew the area better and was out running errands. "We could wait on the porch," she said, her voice polite but cold. As we sat on the swing, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The windows of the house were covered, either with tattered curtains or sheets of newspaper blocking any view inside. "Guess they really value their privacy," Rob remarked, sensing my discomfort. I nodded, forcing a smile, but something about the place felt off. After an hour of waiting, a truck rumbled up the gravel road. Relief surged through us. Rob approached the truck, waving his arms to signal we meant no harm. The driver, a grizzled man in a denim shirt and canvas jacket, stepped out, listening as Rob explained our situation. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the woman step out onto the porch. Her expression had shifted into something sinister, a wide grin stretching unnaturally across her face. "My husband's home," she said in a tone that sent chills down my spine. Before I could process her words, I heard Rob shout, "No! No!" The man raised a pistol and shot him. I froze, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before me. Rob collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. My scream caught in my throat as the woman charged at me with a hatchet, her shrill cry piercing the air. I ran. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I darted into the woods, branches clawing at my skin. The only thought in my mind was to put as much distance as possible between me and the nightmare I had stumbled into. Behind me, I could hear her stumbling and cursing, but I didn't dare look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted deeper into the forest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Collapsing against a tree, I vomited, the sheer terror and exertion overwhelming me. My mind raced with images of Rob. His smile, his laugh, the way he called me his coffee girl. He was gone. I wanted to mourn, but there was no time. They were still out there. Stumbling to my feet, I pressed on. Hours passed, the dense forest seemingly endless. Finally, I reached a road and followed it, desperate for any sign of help. Eventually, I came upon a small house. The elderly couple who lived there welcomed me in, their concern evident as I explained what had happened. They called the police, and I waited in a daze, the reality of the situation sinking in. When the authorities arrived, I led them to the general area of the house. It took days for them to locate it, but by then, it was nothing but ashes. The couple had burned it to the ground, erasing any trace of their crimes. Rob's body was never found. Rob's parents kept him on the missing persons register for years, clinging to the faint hope that his remains would be discovered. But eventually they had him declared legally dead. At his funeral, I read a eulogy that barely scratched the surface of the love we shared. Rob was more than just a partner. He was my best friend. His kindness and generosity touched everyone he met. Though our time together was cut far too short, I am grateful beyond words to have loved him and been loved by him. The cabin was supposed to be a celebration of love and life. Instead, it became a harrowing reminder of how quickly happiness can turn to horror.